So I want you to imagine that you have spent basically the last 5 years meticulously saving up for this absolute perfect life abroad. You know the exact dream I'm talking about.
Yeah, we all know that dream.
Right. You bought the wildly expensive plane ticket. You went ahead and signed a lease on this beautiful little house somewhere near the beach, somewhere where the sun is just always shining.
And you've got the spreadsheet, right? The one where all the math worked out perfectly on your laptop screen.
Exactly, the magical spreadsheet. But then, fast forward 4 years later, you are sitting in an airport terminal waiting for a flight back to your home country. You are completely broke. You are carrying this massive, unexplainable gap on your professional resume, and you're facing a financial situation that is actually much worse than the one you originally tried to escape.
It's a brutal reality check.
Yeah.
And honestly, it is the devastating reality for just an overwhelming number of people who try to leave the West.
It really is.
The Relocate with Revenue Podcast with Jus and Jan.
Today, we are undertaking a pretty massive mission for this deep dive.
Yeah, we're going to dissect exactly why the dream of moving abroad turns into an absolute crushing nightmare for so many people.
Right. Our core topic today is why most people fail when they move abroad. But to truly, deeply understand the anatomy of that failure, we kind of first have to look really closely at the illusion that sets the whole thing up in the first place.
Yeah, you have to put yourself right back into that initial planning phase.
Exactly. And you know exactly what this looks like if you have ever, harbored this dream. It is entirely consuming. You spend all your evenings mapping out your investments.
Absolutely. You meticulously check your retirement savings every single day. You're calculating the exact month, like the exact week, that you can finally just walk into your boss's office and hand in your resignation.
And then you fall down these completely endless rabbit holes online. You're watching streams and streams of YouTube videos about the cost of living in various exotic locales.
Yeah, joining every single expat Facebook group you can possibly find.
Reading hundreds of blog posts written by people who just, seem to be living out your perfect stress-free life. And you build this deeply vivid, highly idealized version of the move in your head.
And in your mind, it feels like pure, unadulterated freedom.
It really does. The destination looks like an absolute paradise. The math seemingly adds up flawlessly on your spreadsheets, like we said. And the escape from that relentless, exhausting grind of your home country feels entirely within your grasp.
But here's the issue. You plan exclusively for the best case scenario. You're just quietly assuming that your sheer willpower and, your desperate desire for this dream to work will somehow magically be enough to sustain it.
Right. And what happens when that willpower hits the actual physical reality of a new country?
Well, the tragedy is that the sheer willpower you just described is completely, utterly useless against mathematical reality. That feeling of freedom fractures. And the truth of that fracture is incredibly cold.
It's so cold because it's almost always driven by a single catastrophic sequencing error, isn't it?
Exactly, a sequencing error. People make the leap before their foundation is actually built. They pack their bags, they book that final flight, and they move their entire lives before their income stream is fully realized.
They execute the relocation before their runway is ready.
Right. That financial buffer, they work so incredibly hard to save up. They move before it is genuinely long enough to handle the chaotic, completely unforeseen variables of international living.
If you think about it structurally, they are essentially trying to build the roof of their new life before the foundation is even poured.
Let alone solid enough to carry the immense weight of existing in a completely foreign country. And that specific decision, making the move in the wrong order, that is the precise reason why the vast majority of people who move abroad end up returning home far earlier than they ever planned.
The math they relied upon just becomes nonsensical, right?
Completely nonsensical when confronted with the harsh realities on the ground. And what is absolutely crucial to understand here is that the dream itself was not necessarily wrong.
Right. The destination they chose was probably perfectly fine. The culture, the weather, the people, none of that was the fatal flaw.
No, the sequence of execution was fundamentally broken. You simply cannot buy long-term freedom with short-term savings. I don't care how carefully you arrange those numbers on a screen before you boarded the plane.
Because savings deplete, right? Only revenue actually sustains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Savings deplete. Revenue sustains.
And that profound distinction between savings and revenue brings us perfectly to the source of today's deep dive. We're looking at the main character whose experiences are really going to guide our entire understanding of this massive failure rate.
Yes, we are diving deep into the work of Emro.
Right, the founder of Relocate with Revenue. Through exploring the incredibly detailed resources over at relocatewithrevenue.com, we're going to unpack Emro's central philosophy today.
And this philosophy is going to anchor absolutely everything we discuss. It is beautifully succinct.
Income first, freedom always.
Income first, freedom always. It's a fundamental rewiring of how people normally approach expatriation.
It really is. When you read through her work, a very specific analogy comes to mind, and I think it perfectly captures the sequencing error we're talking about.
Oh, the scuba diving analogy. I love this one.
It's so good. Moving abroad without an established location-independent income stream is exactly like going scuba diving while only paying attention to the beautiful, colorful fish swimming around you.
While completely, utterly ignoring your oxygen gauge.
Exactly. You are absolutely mesmerized by the new environment. The culture is vibrant, the local food is incredible, the slower pace of life feels deeply, deeply healing. You are just swimming through paradise.
But all the while, you are actively running out of the exact resource you need to survive in that environment.
The oxygen in your tank is your cash flow. If you aren't generating more of it, the clock is ticking the absolute second you hit the water.
And eventually, those alarm bells start ringing.
Right. You have to abandon the beautiful scenery and rush back to the surface in a sheer panic, just gasping for air. Which really makes me wonder, about the psychology of the people making this leap.
It's a fascinating psychology.
If the math of moving abroad, this absolute necessity of the oxygen tank, is so incredibly vital to basic survival, why do so many highly capable, highly intelligent, experienced people get it entirely wrong?
That is the pivotal question. Why do smart people build flawed spreadsheets and end up completely abandoning their dreams?
Yeah. Well,
the answer lies entirely in the harsh realities uncovered by the data. I call it the data of defeat.
The data of defeat. That sounds ominous.
It is. To truly comprehend why brilliant people fail at this, we have to look closely at a massive empirical study conducted by Remitly.
Right, the Remitly study.
They didn't just survey, a few dozen people. They documented and analyzed over 7,000 individual experiences of expats who packed up their entire lives, moved abroad, and ultimately surrendered.
7,000 people who packed up and eventually just returned to their home countries.
Exactly. This dataset gives us the clearest, absolute, most unfiltered picture of what actually drives people back. Let's really break these statistics down systematically, starting with the most prominent factor.
Okay, let's hear it.
Roughly 40 to 50% of all returns are strictly, undeniably financially related.
Wow, nearly half.
Nearly half. They give up the dream simply because the financial runway ran out long before any sustainable revenue was ever built. Their hard-earned savings depleted far, far faster than their most conservative, pessimistic projections.
Now, the logical question there is why? Why do the spreadsheets fail so spectacularly for half of these people?
Because there are massive hidden culprits that spreadsheets rarely capture accurately. First off, the first year in any new country is universally, without exception, drastically more expensive than anyone calculates.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you are setting up an entire human life from scratch.
Exactly. You are paying multiple months of rent just for deposits. You are hit with completely unexpected administrative and visa fees. You're buying essential furniture and basic household goods you didn't think about.
And then there's the invisible drain, right? The basic foreigner tax.
The foreigner tax is real. And to be clear, this isn't a literal tax from the government.
No, it's the cost of making everyday purchasing mistakes before you truly understand the local economy. It's when you shop at the wrong, overpriced grocery store because it looks familiar.
Or you massively overpay for internet installation. Or you hire the wrong local contractor because you don't know the going rates.
Exactly. These micro expenses just constantly bleed the budget.
And second, and this is perhaps the most devastating because it is entirely out of your control, is exchange rate fluctuation.
Oh, that's a huge one.
When your life savings are sitting in one currency, right, but your daily existence is priced in another, a shift in the global markets can be absolutely catastrophic.
You could just be sleeping, and a geopolitical event halfway across the world can quietly slice 20% off your financial runway overnight.
Without you ever spending a single extra dime, your $50,000 buffer suddenly has the purchasing power of $40,000.
The financial buffer is there, providing this profound, comforting, false sense of security right up until the exact moment it suddenly isn't.
Spot on. Furthermore, if we dig even deeper into that exact same Remitly study, we find another deeply connected piece of the puzzle. 27% of returning expats explicitly cite difficulty finding work as the primary reason their dream collapsed.
27%.
Yeah.
Which directly stems from the exact sequencing error we just identified, right? The failure to build the income before the move.
Yes. These are people who arrived in their new paradise with a profoundly flawed, honestly almost arrogant expectation that they would simply, quote, figure it out once their boots were on the ground.
They assume that their professional skills, which were highly valued in the West, will just easily and seamlessly translate to a foreign economy.
Or they assume that remote work is this ubiquitous, guaranteed safety net. Like they can just easily catch a remote job at the last minute if their savings start to dip.
But the reality is a brutal awakening for them. The remote job market is intensely competitive right now. It's heavily gate-kept by algorithms, and it is absolutely not a guarantee.
Not at all. And even worse, the local job market in their new country is almost never designed to absorb foreign nationals.
Local employers really don't want to deal with complex visa sponsorships if they don't have to.
Why would they? Plus, you likely don't speak the language with the absolute, nuanced cultural fluency required for a corporate environment.
And you lack the local networking connections that actually drive hiring. And on top of all that, because you've been living off your savings for a year, you are now coming in with a glaring resume gap.
They essentially maroon themselves economically. They put themselves on an island, relying on a strategy of pure hope rather than a strategy of dependable income.
And hope, unfortunately, does not pay the rent.
It definitely does not.
But let's look at the rest of that data, though. Because there is one specific statistic in that Remitly study that really gave me pause, and I think we need to push back on the purely financial angle just for a second.
Okay, what stood out to you?
Well, 31% of these returning expats cited homesickness as their primary reason for abandoning their relocation and flying back.
Ah, yes, the homesickness metric.
Right. Now, if I am putting myself in their shoes, isn't missing your family, your lifelong friends, and just the deep, innate comfort of your home culture a profoundly legitimate reason to leave?
It seems like it on the surface.
I mean, we are human beings, not just walking bank accounts. Missing the birth of your niece or not being able to hug your aging parents, that is a massive emotional toll.
It is. It's a real emotional weight.
It sounds completely reasonable to me that someone would eventually just say, I just couldn't handle the distance anymore.
But here's where we have to look deeper.
Right, because as I read through the source material, I realized that Rowe's framework forces you to look at that exact statistic through a much darker, incredibly nuanced lens.
Yes, and her conclusion completely reframes how we should think about emotional resilience abroad.
The research clearly shows that homesickness is absolutely a real painful phenomenon. But crucially, it is entirely survivable when financial pressures are completely absent.
Think about it logistically. Missing your family is a manageable, temporary emotional hurdle when you have the abundant funds to simply book a first-class flight home for the holidays.
Exactly. You just stay for a month, get it out of your system, and fly back to your expat life.
Homesickness only mutates into something genuinely unbearable, something that actively breaks your spirit when the money is running out and you realize you are trapped.
It is Rowe's raw, absolutely unvarnished observation that homesickness is very often just the socially acceptable default answer people give to their friends and family back home.
Because it is so much easier,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, it's so much less shameful to look your friends in the eye and say, I missed you guys too much. I just had to come back.
Than it is to admit the crushing truth.
Right, which is, my bank accounts are entirely overdrawn, my credit cards are absolutely maxed out, and I have completely, utterly failed to sustain myself as an adult in the world.
That profound loneliness and the crushing financial strain, they almost always arrive hand in hand.
The economic failure is just quietly masked behind the much more palatable emotional excuse of missing home.
Exactly. The financial terror actively exacerbates every single emotional vulnerability you have. And to really synthesize this macro-level data and understand the sheer gravity of what expats are walking into, we have to layer those Remitly findings with research from INSEAD.
INSEAD, right, which is one of the world's leading, most respected graduate business schools.
Yes, their data provides an incredibly brutal reality check that just strips away all the remaining romance of the expat dream.
What did they find?
According to their comprehensive studies, Up to 50% of all international relocations end in total failure.
50%. Just let that sink in for a second.
Half. Half of everyone who attempts this deeply planned, highly romanticized dream ends up retreating. It is quite literally a coin toss.
But the most crucial, genuinely terrifying element of the INSEAD research isn't just the sheer volume of failure.
No, it's the timeline of the failure.
The timeline.
The average lifespan of an expat who moves without a solid, established revenue foundation is exactly 4 years.
4 years. That is the precise timeline of depletion.
It takes about that long for the entire psychological and financial cycle to run its course.
Mm-hmm.
Year 1 is the honeymoon phase. It's expensive, but it's completely exhilarating.
And then year 2 is when the initial excitement sort of fades into a daily routine and those tiny spreadsheet cracks start to show.
Right. Year 3 is when the savings begin to aggressively bleed out. That realization hits that local employment just isn't happening, and the real panic sets in.
And year 4 is when the credit limits were finally exhausted, the debt becomes insurmountable, and the surrender occurs.
4 years, and then they retreat. And the truly heartbreaking part of this cycle is that they almost universally return to their home country in a significantly worse financial position than when they initially left.
They have lost 4 prime earning years, they have completely burned through their nest egg, and they are essentially starting over from a massive deficit.
The statistics, the 50% failure rate, the 4-year lifespan, the 83% overall failure rates we see across different metrics, they clearly show us the what of this massive phenomenon.
Right, but numbers on a page can be pretty sterile.
They can. To truly understand the how, to really understand how it actually feels in your chest to sit in a foreign country and watch your meticulously planned dream die a slow, agonizing death, we have to pivot away from the macro data.
We have to examine Emro's deeply personal crucible.
Yes, we have to look at the fire she walked through.
I couldn't agree more, because looking at Emro's story really strips away any illusion that this failure only happens to people who are reckless or somehow unprepared.
Her relocation nightmare is literally the absolute center of gravity for why she built the Relocate with Revenue framework in the first place.
You really need to understand her background to grasp the severity of her situation.
Because Emro was not some naive 22-year-old backpacker who just hopped on a plane on a whim hoping to, find herself.
Not at all. She was a deeply experienced professional realtor and a highly competent homeowner. She thoroughly understood the mechanics of property. She understood complex investments. She understood cash flow projections.
And despite all of that elite knowledge, she still fell into a massive, unavoidable trap.
Her backstory reads like a sudden, devastating cascade of events that completely obliterated a highly intelligent, seemingly foolproof plan.
So what exactly happened to her setup?
Well, in her home jurisdiction, she had built a really solid portfolio operating short-term rentals. This was her foundation, her financial engine.
Okay.
But completely without warning, the local government instituted a sudden, sweeping change to the bylaws governing these exact types of rentals.
Oh, wow, a bylaw change.
Yeah, and it wasn't a gradual phase-out, it was immediate. Overnight, aggressive, crippling fines started arriving in the mail, completely upending the legal and financial viability of her assets.
Because she could no longer legally operate the properties as she had planned and budgeted for. So the carrying costs suddenly became a monstrous burden.
Exactly. The mortgages, the property taxes, the daily maintenance, those bills don't care about a bylaw change. They just kept coming. And they began rapidly, aggressively consuming all of her built-up equity.
And the truly terrifying part of a regulatory shift like that is that she wasn't alone in this crisis, right?
No. Every single short-term rental operator in that entire jurisdiction was hit by the exact same bylaw change at the exact same moment.
It means the market flooded.
Exactly. This caused the local real estate market to completely flood with desperate, bleeding sellers virtually overnight.
So Emro, the seasoned real estate professional, found herself trapped in a corner. She was forced into a devastating sale at a massive financial loss.
The market took something she simply could not afford to lose. And the underlying math of her entire life, the math that was supposed to fund her freedom, became entirely nonsensical.
The psychological impact of that profound financial trauma cannot be overstated.
No, it really can't.
Because it deeply and permanently informed every single step Emro took next. It rewired her entire approach to risk.
How so?
Well, when she eventually made her pivot, packed up what was left, and arrived in Nairobi, Kenya, she made a very deliberate, highly strategic choice that ran counter to her entire professional background.
What did she do?
She rented.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
She rented instead of buying.
exactly. Now, think about the magnitude of that decision. She was a real estate professional. Her entire career, her entire mindset naturally gravitated toward property ownership as the ultimate symbol of security and wealth.
But the psychological wound of that forced sale at a massive loss was simply too deep, too raw, and too fresh.
Right. She fundamentally refused to even consider buying property in a new country. She recognized that physical assets could become physical traps.
So even though renting long-term wasn't the original grand wealth-building plan she had mapped out years prior, it became an absolutely necessary, highly calculated survival tactic.
It gave her agility. And we also need to emphasize that her arrival in Nairobi wasn't some random dart thrown at a map out of pure desperation.
Oh, not at all. It was the result of intense, rigorous, almost exhaustive due diligence.
Before committing, she had taken 2 separate, dedicated exploratory trips to Kenya, specifically to verify the data on the ground.
She didn't just trust the internet. She mathematically calculated the dramatically lower cost of living compared to the West using real, local numbers she gathered herself.
And she found a city that was not only economically viable for her recovering budget, but also incredibly alive, warm, culturally rich, and full of limitless possibilities.
She did absolutely everything right regarding the destination. But even with all of that correct preparation, even with the geographical pivot, she was still carrying the massive, invisible weight of the financial damage from the real estate trap back home.
The foundation was already cracked before she even unpacked her bags.
And that cracked foundation is what leads us into what I think is the most powerful, visceral part of Emro's entire narrative.
It's an extended, incredibly haunting reflection on how a financial runway actually runs out in the real world.
Yes. Because when we sit in our comfortable living rooms and imagine running out of money, we almost always picture a dramatic, explosive event.
We picture a massive medical emergency, a terrible car crash, or some singular, catastrophic, impulsive purchase that just drains the bank account in one fell swoop.
We picture a sudden tragedy, but Emro provides this brilliant, terrifying analogy for how financial depletion actually happens to expats on the ground.
It's the water analogy, right?
Yes, she says the runway depletion happens quietly. She describes it, quote, the way that water finds a crack and widens it.
Just sit with that image for a second. The way water finds a crack and widens it.
Imagine you are in your beautiful new country. You are living your daily life, going to the local markets, enjoying the sunshine. And month by month, there is just a tiny, seemingly insignificant gap between the spreadsheet projections you made back home and the reality of what things actually cost.
Maybe the local groceries are just 10% more than you budgeted.
Maybe the electricity bill spikes because the air conditioning is older than you thought.
Or maybe the currency exchange rate dipped just a fraction of a cent.
The gap is incredibly small. The buffer of your savings is still sitting right there in your bank account looking robust, so you absolutely do not panic.
You ride the wave. You tell yourself it will naturally balance out next month.
Yeah.
You'll eat out a little less. You'll be more careful.
But the water is in the crack, and the pressure is constant. Month by month, that tiny gap gets wider. The money going out consistently, relentlessly eclipses the money coming in.
It isn't a dramatic explosion. It is a quiet, deadly bleed.
Until one month, you log into your online banking, you look at your accounts, and the runway is drastically, shockingly smaller than it should be.
And then the next month, it shrinks again, but faster this time.
You are literally sitting in a literal paradise, watching your financial runway vanish in real time, actively bleeding cash.
The math is presenting you with a stark reality that your brain desperately, fundamentally does not want to see. The money will not last as long as you planned, and the miraculous revenue you quietly hoped for simply isn't arriving.
That realization, when you finally acknowledge that the water has widened the crack and the dam is breaking, that is the most terrifying phase of the expat journey.
When you hit that phase of actively bleeding cash in a foreign country, all the romance just evaporates, and the reality becomes incredibly, brutally stark.
You realize the buffer is gone, the safety net is shredded, and you are backed into a corner thousands of miles from home.
And at this exact pivotal moment, you only have 3 choices. Let's outline them clearly, because understanding these choices is the key to understanding the 83% failure rate.
Okay, what is choice A?
Choice A is to simply wait and hope. This is a paralysis response. You freeze and you hope that somehow the universe will miraculously intervene and things will turn around magically.
For instance, we see many people in this phase desperately hoping their new YouTube channel, where they document their quirky expat life, will suddenly go viral and the monetization will save them.
But as Imro pointedly and aggressively notes, YouTube views will not save you. Hoping is an emotional state. It is absolutely not a financial strategy.
So what's choice B?
Choice B is to leave. This is the path of least resistance, the path of surrender. And it is the exact choice that the vast majority of that 83% failure rate ultimately takes.
They pack up their pride, admit defeat, and book the flight back.
But the deep tragedy of choice B is what happens when the plane actually lands. You almost always return to a significantly worse situation than the one you originally left.
Your life savings are completely gone, evaporated. You now have a multi-year gap in your employment history that you have to explain to highly skeptical hiring managers.
And you have to start over from below zero, carrying the heavy emotional baggage of a failed dream.
Which leaves choice C.
Yes. Choice C is to go incredibly hard. It requires you to look the terrifying reality of the situation dead in the eye, stop hoping, and aggressively build a location-independent income stream right then and there.
From the ground up, while the clock is relentlessly ticking.
It requires immense, exhausting effort. But it is the only viable path forward that doesn't involve surrendering the dream entirely.
And obviously, looking at the success she built, Imro chose option C.
She did.
She describes that harrowing period in Nairobi watching the runway deplete after the massive real estate loss as her ultimate come-to-Jesus moment. She didn't retreat.
It was the intense, unforgiving crucible that forced her to completely rebuild her approach from the ground up, stronger and infinitely more resilient.
It was a true phoenix rising from the ashes of her original shattered plans. She had this profound realization that she actually had to go through that painful, terrifying loss in order to truly understand the unforgiving mechanics of expat survival.
She couldn't have learned it from a book. She had to feel the bleed.
And she used that intense, high-stakes, real-world experience to create a highly specific architectural blueprint. She designed a system specifically built to solve this universal, devastating expat problem.
She essentially designed a functional cure for the 83% failure rate.
But because of the trauma of her real estate trap, where she was absolutely crushed by carrying costs, local regulations, and physical assets she ultimately couldn't control, Imro set incredibly strict, unbending parameters for the new business she was going to build.
These weren't just casual preferences. These were absolute non-negotiables for survival.
Let's walk through those non-negotiables. First, she completely refused to ever again carry the agonizing, stressful weight of a physical business.
The new enterprise had to be 100% location independent. It had to be a digital entity that could travel seamlessly with her across any border, on any airplane, at a moment's notice.
It could require absolutely no physical presence anywhere in the world.
It could hold zero physical inventory. No warehouses, no shipping logistics, no physical products that could get stuck in customs somewhere.
It could require no local staff, meaning she wouldn't have to navigate complex foreign labor laws or confusing payroll taxes.
And most importantly, perhaps the biggest lesson from her past, it could never, ever involve signing commercial lease agreements.
She demanded total, absolute agility and complete freedom from any form of physical overhead. If the business couldn't exist entirely within her laptop, she just wasn't going to build it.
Those non-negotiables are the actual foundation of true leverage. But we do have to address the reality of the timeline here.
Right, because building that ultimate, highly agile, beautifully automated business ecosystem takes time.
It takes months, sometimes years, of sustained effort to truly gain traction. And time is the exact resource you emphatically do not have when your runway is actively, aggressively depleting month by month.
So we absolutely must highlight a crucial, highly pragmatic interim strategy that Imro executed. This is absolutely vital for anyone listening who might be in the middle of this panic right now.
Before the grand, perfectly automated business ecosystem was fully built and scaling, she survived by focusing entirely on generating immediate, real-world revenue.
She didn't sit around waiting for the perfect business plan to manifest on paper. She went to work immediately with the tools she had.
First, she immediately offered freelance services to generate fast, dependable cash flow. She traded her existing skills for money in the digital marketplace.
Second, she leaned heavily into the intense, rigorous due diligence she had already performed on Kenya. She recognized that her knowledge was incredibly valuable.
She began organizing and leading physical exploratory trips for other people who were sitting back in the West, considering a move to Nairobi.
She leveraged her own hard-won knowledge, her own mistakes, and her deep understanding of the local landscape to help others who desperately needed to see the destination firsthand. She monetized her own learning curve immediately.
But she didn't just play offense. She played relentless defense.
Simultaneously, while aggressively chasing every dollar of income, she ruthlessly and methodically reduced her entire cost structure.
She executed a brutal line-by-line review of every single expense in her life. She stripped away absolutely anything that did not directly, measurably serve her ultimate plan of survival.
Crucially, though, she did this without compromising the fundamental joy and quality of life she'd moved there to experience.
This highlights a profound structural insight from Emro. A financial gap is never just a revenue problem, and it is never just a cost problem.
It is always both.
Always. To survive the bleed, you must aggressively attack the gap from both ends simultaneously, violently forcing your expenses down while relentlessly forcing your revenue up until they cross.
So once the immediate bleeding was finally stabilized, once she had enough freelance and consulting cash flow to just breathe without panicking, Emro turned her full, undivided attention to the long-term cure.
She exhaustively researched every single conceivable online business model.
She looked at the massive, overwhelming noise of the internet and distilled it all down to a highly curated, deeply vetted, reduced list of just 5 viable location-independent models.
These are the only 5 models she deemed reliable enough to actually work for expats whose literal survival depends on them.
Let's really break these down because this is the core of the blueprint. Number 1, freelance services.
This is taking your existing professional skills, writing, coding, graphic design, project management, and offering them digitally to a global client base. You are trading time for money, but you are doing it in a strong currency while living in a weaker one.
Very smart. Number 2, e-commerce models that strictly, entirely avoid inventory.
We are talking specifically about things like dropshipping or print on demand. In this model, you handle the marketing, the branding, and the customer acquisition, but you never, ever touch a physical product or manage a warehouse. The supplier ships directly to the customer.
Amazing. Number 3, service-based consulting.
This is distinct from freelancing. This is where high-level, specialized expertise like strategic business planning, financial forecasting, or specialized legal consulting is delivered entirely remotely, usually over high-ticket video calls.
Number 4, content delivery that builds a monetizable audience.
Think of YouTube channels, highly engaged TikTok accounts, Instagram brands, or a massive LinkedIn presence.
But Emro attaches a massive, glowing red, non-negotiable warning to this 4th model.
Yes, if you're spending hours and hours every day on these social platforms creating content, and they're not actively, measurably putting real revenue in your pocket, you must stop lending them your eyeballs immediately.
Do not confuse mindlessly scrolling and hoping for virality with actual audience building. One is a business, the other is a debilitating distraction.
And finally, number 5, coaching and mentoring.
Which involves guiding other people through specific, difficult transformations, whether business, health, or personal, based entirely on your own specialized lived experience.
Having those 5 viable options is incredibly empowering. But here is where Emro's specific formwork elevates from just a list of ideas into an incredibly specific, structurally brilliant architecture.
Because it is human nature, especially when you are panicked and highly motivated by survival, to look at those 5 viable models and think, well, if I am incredibly driven and my literal survival depends on generating cash, I should just launch all 5 of these businesses simultaneously to guarantee that I make enough money.
You think if one fails, the others will surely catch me, but that instinct is a massive, fatal trap.
Emro explicitly and firmly warns against this shotgun approach, accurately labeling it self-cannibalism.
If you try to execute all 5 models at once, you will spread your mental energy, your time, and your marketing capital so devastatingly thin that every single initiative will ultimately fail. You will completely burn out before you ever reach profitability.
So instead of the scattershot approach, she developed a proprietary ecosystem based firmly on the rule of 3. The rule of 3. You must select exactly 3 subsets from that curated list of 5. No more, no less.
And these 3 chosen models act as deeply interconnected, mutually supportive spokes on a wheel with your core ideal client sitting right in the center of the hub.
Let us actually track how this specific ecosystem practically evolves in the real world. In the very beginning, when you are just launching, your business is small and it's fragile. The hub of your wheel looks and acts like a simple tricycle wheel.
It's functional, it gets you moving forward, but it is fairly basic and slow.
However, as you diligently execute the rule of three, a fascinating mechanism takes over. Your revenue streams begin to cross-pollinate.
The audience you build through content delivery starts booking your consulting services. Your freelance clients start buying your coaching packages.
As this cross-pollination happens and your client base rapidly expands, that flimsy tricycle wheel evolves into a much faster, heavier, more robust motorcycle wheel. It has real momentum.
And eventually, with consistent, disciplined execution over years, it becomes a heavily reinforced car wheel, capable of carrying massive weight, incredible speed, and withstanding massive shocks to the system.
The ultimate overarching genius of this specific three-spoke architecture is the long-term endgame. You are not building a location-independent business just to take on indefinite, crushing stress in a beautiful new country.
Right. You didn't leave the corporate grind just to build a digital grind.
Exactly. By structuring it as a highly systemized wheel with three distinct interwoven revenue spokes, you are fundamentally building a transferable asset.
The ultimate goal is that eventually the business ecosystem runs so smoothly, so completely independent of your daily labor, that you can sell off a piece of it to an investor or sell the entire business outright for a massive exit.
That fundamentally is what true financial freedom looks like.
That concept of the endgame is so vital to all of this. When we zoom out and synthesize the ultimate mission of all of this material we've covered, the core beating heart of MRO's digital relocation blueprint is absolute, undeniable empowerment.
Yes, what she has built is a proprietary system that elegantly, systematically solves one of the most stressful, paralyzing problems that modern, ambitious people face today.
It's that deep, burning, almost spiritual desire to leave the exhausting grind of the West, combined with the terrifying, paralyzing reality of not having a massive, multi-million-dollar investment portfolio to fall back on.
Her blueprint proves with mathematical certainty that you do not need to be independently wealthy or a trust fund beneficiary to successfully move abroad.
You do not need millions in the bank. You just need to be digitally strategic. You need to build an architecture, a machine that generates reliable income regardless of your geographic coordinates on a map.
The entire Relocate with Revenue methodology, every single piece of advice, every harsh warning, is designed specifically to spare people the agonizing, soul-crushing heartache of watching their carefully planned, deeply loved dreams evaporate into thin air simply because they didn't understand the sequence of survival.
She is actively trying to stop that 83% failure rate in its tracks by forcing people to build the foundation before they ever book the flight.
Exactly. And as we look at the sobering reality of these failure statistics, and as we analyze the incredibly resilient framework Embro has built directly from the ashes of her own painful experience, it is absolutely essential that you, the listener, evaluate exactly where you are in your own story right now.
Ro frequently asks her audience to perform this exact audit, and it is a vital, non-negotiable exercise for your survival. You need to be deeply honest with yourself.
Are you currently still physically trapped in the West, feeling the heavy daily toll of the corporate job, dreaming every night of a way out, but completely paralyzed by the overwhelming logistics?
Or are you currently deep in the planning stage, meticulously updating those spreadsheets we talked about, quietly hoping your finite savings will somehow magically be enough to sustain you indefinitely?
Or perhaps, and this is the most critical one, you have already made the leap.
Yeah.
You are sitting in your beautiful new country right now. You are looking out at the ocean, but the water has found the crack in your finances.
And you are quietly, terrifyingly bleeding cash every single month, pretending everything is fine.
Or maybe you have finally recognized the fatal flaw in your initial plan, and you are currently in the messy, painful, exhausting process of repositioning and rebuilding your life from the ground up.
Wherever you are in that spectrum, you must brutally, unflinchingly acknowledge your current reality without a shred of ego.
Recognizing your exact current phase is the only possible way you can determine the precise next best step to take to ensure you don't become just another anonymous statistic in that 82% failure rate.
And if you are listening to this right now and you have recognized that you are in one of those dangerous phases and you are finally ready to take that next best step, there is a path forward.
If you are ready to stop just hoping your runway miraculously extends itself and start actually building the machinery of your freedom, there's a very clear, actionable step.
Ro hosts something called the RWR Weekend Workshop. This isn't just a brief overview. It is a highly comprehensive, intense 2.5-hour live monthly session where she goes incredibly in-depth.
She walks you step by step through the process of teaching you exactly how to construct this proprietary three-spoke ecosystem for yourself, tailored to your specific skills.
It is the literal tactical execution of every single high-level concept we have unpacked today. You can find all the necessary details, look at the upcoming dates, and secure your spot by heading directly over to relocatewithrevenue.com.
You can also use the contact information provided on that website to email any highly specific personal questions you might have about your own situation.
The resources are sitting right there, waiting for you to use them. They exist to ensure you pour the concrete of your foundation before you ever try to support the massive weight of your new life abroad.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over long after this audio stops playing. It builds directly on everything we have unpacked from Emro's profound insights.
What's the thought?
Well, as a society, we spend years, sometimes decades, grinding away, saving up our hard-earned money to buy what we desperately think is physical freedom. We buy the expensive one-way plane ticket.
We pay thousands for the complicated long-term visa.
We confidently sign the multi-year lease on that beautiful rental house near the beach. We acquire all the physical, tangible markers of escape. We think we've purchased our way out.
But what if physical freedom is actually a complete, total illusion if it isn't firmly anchored by digital location-independent leverage?
Exactly. If your income is still stubbornly tied to a physical location back home, or far worse, if you have no income stream at all and you were just slowly burning through a pile of cash, you haven't actually bought long-term freedom.
You have merely bought a very expensive temporary vacation that comes with a terrifying expiration date.
Before you pack your bags, before you sell your car, and before you declare your ultimate independence from the grind of the West, you must look in the mirror and ask yourself a very difficult, very honest question.
Are you genuinely relocating your life to build a sustainable future? Or are you just temporarily relocating your profound financial anxieties to a more exotic time zone?
That is the ultimate question that separates the successful expats from the statistics. You have to ensure your foundation is completely unshakable before you test it against the reality of the world.
Remember Emro's core mantra, the absolute truth that defines the success of this entire journey? Don't wait until you move to start earning. Income first, then freedom, always. Thank you so much for joining us on the Relocate with Revenue podcast. We will see you on the next deep dive.